Hey John. So, although it's logical for Tentir to be cautious after the undead encounter, I think it would be more in keeping with the central character to do a little tentative exploring. Elves are probably more cautious than humans in general, since they're so long-lived but are equally susceptible to death, so he might not take any really wild risks. His curiosity, brashness, and desire to impress his brother, though, might nudge him down a side corridor if he thinks it could yield a useful discovery. Also, I just think it makes for a more engaging story. Hopefully it doesn't end in tragedy, but if it does, it'll certainly add some drama.
The following podcast is intended for a mature audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome back to Tale of the Manticore, Season 3. Like the creature from which it takes its name, Tale of the Manticore is a mashup, a crossbreeding between two different species of storytelling. Here you will find the unpredictability of old-school paper and dice games with the storycraft of a dark fantasy novel. No character is sacred, and none will be spared if the dice decide their fate is at hand. According to lore, the tail of a manticore is barbed with cruel iron spikes. There will be much pain in the days ahead. Last time on Tale of the Manticore. Chapter 21 begins with the cursed wraith of Queen Anaya offering the companions a kind of deal. If they sacrifice Fairwind to her, she will let the rest of them go free. Was Fairwind about to lay down his life to save the others? We cannot know, because before he can respond, Achillea sends a jarring psychic blast at the Wraith Queen by way of her last message spell. After that, the fight is on, and the Queen's animated skeletal warriors rush to the attack. Achillea and the Queen can't participate effectively in the battle, so it's really Cord, Tentir, Dureni, and Fairwind against the two undead opponents. Although they're outnumbered, the skeletal warriors have a special defense. They only take half damage from slashing weapons, making Dureni and Tentir's attacks much less effective. After a surprising string of critical failures and hits, the PCs vanquish the enemy, and the Queen retreats, apparently back to the Netherworld. Post-battle, Fairwind, who has taken a wound, faints. When he comes to, his torchlight has expired, and it is dark. By now, Tentir has already been sent off on his own to retrieve a replacement light. Tentir considers investigating part of the unexplored sections of this crypt alone, but that would be unwise and reckless, foolish even. Most of all, it would be dangerous. You might remember that in the last episode, before combat began, there was a moment where it seemed that battle might be avoided. The Queen offered to let Achillea, Cord, Dureni, and Tentir go free if they sacrificed Fairwind to her. Of course, Achillea didn't let that happen. I bring it up because the situation came from my mythic event meaning, tense agreement. The idea was to present an offer of an agreement that would cause tension. Tense agreement. I think it made the encounter a bit more flavorful than it might have otherwise been, and it will probably have the effect of strengthening the growing bond between the cleric and the other companions too. At any rate, I need to roll a new event meeting. Here we go, on a D100. 33 and 44. That's, let's see, stop prison. Okay. No ideas at the moment, but that's par for the course. I'll let it percolate and move on. The main thing I need to work out before I begin this episode's narrative is how to handle Tentir's foray into the unexplored parts of this crypt, now that Kevin has replied to my email to say that he will indeed do that. After receiving that reply, I wrote back to suggest we do a little play-by email. I'd send him situations, he would respond with Tentir's actions, and we would proceed like that until there was enough material to write a scene. With this in mind, I could go into full DM mode, but I still want a bit of chaos for my part of the game, so to that end I will continue to generate the dungeon randomly. Here's what I have in mind. For each new place Tentir explores, I'll roll a d10. On a 1 to 4, there will not be any kind of danger or benefit there. That doesn't indicate an empty room, necessarily. It just means that the room won't introduce any risk or reward. On a 5 or 6, it'll only contain danger, a trap or monster, probably. On a 7 to 8, it'll have something good or useful. On a 9 to 10, there will be both, a benefit and a hazard. Now, I told Kevin that going off alone would be very dangerous, so both risk and reward will be high over the course of this little game within a game experiment. Couple more decisions. For each new place, I'll roll a second d10, and on a 1 to 2, there will be another exit. Any other roll will indicate a dead end. I'll do all these rolls off mic, by the way, and keep the results hidden. Finally, if Tenter continues to explore room after room and finds nothing interesting along the way, I will force a danger, benefit, or both to occur in the last available place. I hope that all makes sense. It's exciting for me to give up player control like this, but I'm also worried for Tenter. Well, it's up to Kevin and the Dice Gods to decide how it'll play out now. I'm going to roll some d10s, send an email to Kevin, and get this thing started. Chapter 22, Part 1, Day 16. Early evening. Mythic event meaning. Stop, prison. Party status. Tenter, 10 out of 10 hit points. Tenter stalked off down the corridor, back towards the intersection with a head full of steam. Durrani probably hadn't meant to embarrass him, but he'd done so all the same. Suggesting he should take Achillea with him on such a simple task was insulting. What made it worse, although Tenter would never admit it to himself or anyone else, was that Durrani had been right. Right as usual. He was afraid, and as soon as his temper cooled, he felt the fear resurface. What was he doing, walking through a series of haunted hallways alone? Just up ahead was where they had encountered the headless ghost of the prince. Might it still be there? It had pointed them towards the inner crypt where they'd been attacked. Had it all been a trap? If so, wasn't it possible that the spirit still lingered, waiting for the opportunity to do further mischief? Where the supernatural was concerned, logic held no governance, and so Tenter's mind reeled with wild conjecture, each notion making less sense than the last. If he hadn't made such a show of his bravery by walking out on Durrani in a huff, he might have turned back, but even the fear of the undead was not enough to make him do that. Tenter forced his leaden steps to continue until he reached the four-way intersection. When he arrived and nothing happened, though his chest was tight, he let out a short breath of relief. The passage continued into the gloom, straight ahead, and both to his left and right. To get to Fairwind's little campfire, he should turn right. He knew that much. But there were these other two passages, yet unexplored. He moistened his lips. He was frightened, yes, but he was also his mother's son, her little mouse, just as Durrani had said. If he wanted to live an exceptional life, if he wanted to prove himself, he would need to learn to master his fear. The heroes of legend did not whimper and blanch. Chuchin hadn't quaked like a leaf in a storm when his final battle had begun. He knew the courage was inside him, if he could just find it. Tenter took a single impulsive step to the left and felt his guts flush, as though with ice water. He grit his teeth and willed himself to continue, but his body did not want to obey his mind.
Do it,
he told himself.
You are the brave little mouse. You are in control. You can choose courage.
He tightened his hand around the hilt of his short sword. His palm was slick with sweat.
Go, little mouse.
Dramatis Personae. Tenter. 35 years ago. For Tenter, childhood was a simpler time. He was typical of 10-year-old elven boys and had all the usual joys, fears, and overwrought sense of justice that most children have. Even then, he and Durrani were fast friends. That was one thing that never seemed to change. The two brothers were playing together one particular evening when their father instructed them to go to bed, pointing out that the sun had set hours earlier. The boys had protested and begged to be allowed another half hour before they had to retire. To spare her husband the usual argument, the boy's mother had intervened with the offer of a compromise.
You may stay awake for a while longer, and I'll even tell you a story, if you agree to go right to bed without complaint when it is done.
The boys readily agreed, and this is the story they were told.
This is called The Tale of Two Owls. In a quiet, moonlit forest, a wise old mouse huddled in his cozy burrow. Beside him was his young pupil, barely more than a pup. The wise old mouse declared, "Inside each of us there are two owls. One is calm and wise, filled with patience, understanding, and peace. This owl sees the world clearly, with empathy and compassion." He paused, allowing the young mouse to reflect on the feeling of stillness that comes with wisdom. "The other owl," the mouse continued, "is restless and angry, filled with wrath and hunger and violence. This owl is the terror of the night sky." The young mouse trembled. He knew all too well what these predators were capable of, and how they struck from above without warning. The wise old mouse cleared his throat and continued. "Yes, these two owls exist inside each of us. They are locked in battle with one another and fight for control over every mouse's heart." The young mouse looked at him, wide-eyed and with whiskers a-tremble, and asked, "But master, which owl will win in the end?" The old mouse gave a soft, knowing smile and said, "Little mouse, the one who will win is the one that you feed."
Chapter 22, Part 2, Day 16. Early evening. Mythic event meaning. Stop, prison. Party status. 10 tier. 10 out of 10 hit points. 10 tier grit his teeth and walked down the left hall, going in the opposite way that he was meant to. It was a deliberate choice to put safety to his back and walk headlong into the unknown. His heart thumped in his breast, but it began to calm down after he had taken just the first 10 steps. Another 10, and he really started to feel more confident. Incredibly, when he was 30 feet into the hallway, he realized that he was wearing a smile. A tight, unhappy smile, but a smile nonetheless. Furthermore, the ice in his belly had been replaced by a hot sensation, as though he'd swallowed an ember and it was blooming inside him. He quickened his step. Now he could see that the tunnel ended some 60 feet ahead, at the limit of his dark vision, though he couldn't make out any details yet. When he could, he saw that the hall terminated in a stone staircase going up, but even before he closed the remaining distance, he could tell that the entire thing had collapsed. It was filled with rubble to the ceiling. When he arrived, his suspicion that there would be absolutely no going through was confirmed. The collapse was total. There weren't even any gaps in the fallen masonry that he could see through. He thought briefly how strange it was that an earthquake, or perhaps it had simply been time and erosion, whatever had caused this collapse, had done such localized damage. The hallway before the stairwell was completely intact. There were neither cracks in the ceiling nor in the flagstones of the floor. In truth, he felt disappointed. All that effort to motivate himself to explore on his own, and he had found absolutely nothing. Going back to report this would be worse than not mentioning his little excursion at all. Dureni would give him a tongue-lashing for his recklessness if he returned with nothing significant to share. However, if he brought something useful... Tenter turned and retraced his steps back to the intersection. Without even thinking about it, he turned left, once again foregoing the correct route in favor of one not yet explored. He could see that this corridor went another 50 feet and then turned to the left. Suddenly, stopping in his tracks, the young elf remembered the sprung trap he and the others had found and bypassed earlier. His free hand moved unconsciously to touch his side, while he imagined stepping on a pressure plate and having a spear skewer him sideways. Cursing himself for not having taken appropriate precautions, Tenter decided that he needed to start now. If there was another trap, like the previous one, whatever had triggered it was probably a tripwire or a pressure plate. It would be wise to walk on one side of the passage, hugging the wall and also probing ahead of him with the tip of his sword. This he did, slowing his pace to half of what it had been and navigating the corridor up to the bend with extreme caution. He reached the turn without incident, but remained vigilant as he rounded it and found himself looking down a second section of hallway. Like all the others they had seen thus far, it terminated in an open archway with a chamber beyond. Tentir could see two man-shaped figures in the room ahead, but they were standing so rigid and tall that he assumed they were just another pair of statues. Although curious to get a closer look, he took his time and congratulated himself on his prudence as he crept forward, all the while probing ahead with the tip of his sword. Eventually he reached the archway and could see the contents of the chamber. It was a smallish one, just 30 feet by 30 feet square. What he had taken for statues were not, in fact, statues at all. They were suits of armor wired to a pair of posts so that they appeared to stand up on their own. Of the two sets, one was fully 6 feet tall as Fairwind, Tentir thought. The other was made for someone only a little smaller than himself, about 4 feet. The bigger suit was of uninterrupted plate and chain, all the way from its lobstered feet to its great helm. It was very imposing, and even though Tentir could see through the helm's visor slit that there was nothing inside it, he felt a pang of fear all the same. He willed it away and looked at the smaller suit. This one was a partial suit. It had gaps where the owner might have worn leather breeches and boots, but still showed steel greaves, skirt, breastplate, vambraces, and a chain coif. It had no helmet, and thus no head. Both suits bore arms. Gauntleted fists came together in front of where a belt buckle might have been, and rested on the pommel of a sword, set blade down so that the point rested on the stone floor. All items were badly rusted, flaking in patches of light and dark corrosive blooms. It was a shame, thought Tentir, because Fairwind could certainly have used some kind of armor. Unfortunately, this was all worthless. The two steel suits were not the only things in the room, although they did draw the eye first. To the right, a narrow shelf had been built into the wall. It held a dozen ceramic pots. To either side of this shelf was a crescent-bearing stanchion of about Tentir's height. Looking the other way, opposite the shelf and tucked neatly against the facing wall, he saw a chest of wood and banded iron on the floor. The hasp, corners, and iron bands were all just as badly rusted as the armor, but Tentir noticed with interest that the chest had no lock. Tentir's attention was suddenly interrupted by a light but very cold gust of air that seemed to pass right through him. He shuddered as a chill shivered his whole body. He spun to the right, then to the left. There was nobody else there, but something had changed. Something about the smaller suit of armor drew his eye, and what he saw made his breath catch. The short sword was no longer rusted. In fact, it gleamed like burnished silver. Against the mottled rust and cobwebs of the rest of the armor, it could not have stood out more. Tentir was filled with wonder and immediately stepped forward to grasp its hilt. But something stopped him. He could imagine Durrani's disapproving face if he were to do something so risky, and he heard his brother's voice in his mind.
Touch nothing.
Clearly, there was magic at work here. It would be wise to use caution. He should probably leave and report, but he could not deny that he was drawn to the blade. He forced himself to ignore it for now and instead turned to his right, where ceramic jars sat in rows upon a shelf, flanked by stanchions. The cressets atop them were almost certainly lamps. Surely it would be better to return with one of these rather than a feeble torch. Each jar was about the size and shape of an apple, slightly bigger at the top than at the base. Each also had a plug of wax at the top, although upon inspection, Tentir found that all but two had dried and cracked with age. Quickly lifting and setting down each jar in turn revealed that only the two with intact seals had any weight to them. The rest were empty. Tentir selected one of the heavier jars, and, using the tip of an arrow, he scraped off some of the wax. The young elf had the hem of his cloak pressed over his mouth and nose, and was pointing the top of the jar away from him, afraid that some noxious cloud might be released when his arrowhead broke the seal. But no such thing occurred, and, upon sniffing the contents, Tentir was confident that he had found 2 large flasks of oil. He emptied half of the jar he was holding into the nearest cresset, and lit it with his tinderbox. It flared to glorious life, and Tentir could not help but look at the sword as it caught and reflected the lamp's orange glow. In the moment that his dark vision gave way to his normal vision, he saw, for just the space of a single breath, a face reflected in the blade. It wasn't his own. It was the face of a young boy. When Tentir blinked, it was gone.
Prince Learhain?
He asked in a whisper.
Are you here?
Silence was the only reply. Not yet daring to touch it, Tentir crouched down so that he could really study the blade. It stood out in such bright contrast against the mottled browns and oranges of the rusted metal around it that Tentir thought it almost seemed not of this world. The hilt, crossguard, and pommel sparkled as though there were crushed diamonds mixed in with the metal. A pair of markings had been etched into the blade just above the crossguard and either side of the fuller. One was of a circle with 3 wavy lines reaching out from it, spaced at equal distances from each other. The second marking was a trio of diamonds. The dwarves, Tentir knew, used such symbols as maker's marks. Perhaps humans did the same. Removing his cloak, Tentir used it to snatch up the sword, bundling it and making sure that no part of him touched it. The time to inspect it more fully would come later, he decided. By now, the others would be expecting his return, and he didn't wish for them to worry. He shifted his new prize to his free hand, put the remaining intact flask of oil into his pack, grabbed the stanchion, and turned to go. But then the rusted chest caught his attention once again, and he hesitated, biting his lip. What harm would it do to take a quick look? No, he should leave it alone. They could all return together later on and investigate it properly. On the other hand, he was already here, and it was easy to imagine the others not wanting to come back this way at all. So what should he do? There's a couple of things I'd like to talk about before I let the story progress. First, this is a rare kind of episode in that it splits the party and concentrates exclusively on the actions of a single character. One of my rules in Tale of the Manticore is that PCs advance towards the next level by surviving episodes in which they are actively adventuring and contributing to the story. They should also be in some amount of danger. Achillea, Cord, Fairwind, and Dureni are essentially not in this episode, and so they will not make any progress toward their next levels. Tentir will, however, since he is adventuring and is also in significant danger. Actually, he is in potentially mortal danger. Tentir doesn't know it, and neither does Kevin Berenger, who voices him and, for now, is controlling his actions. Let me go back and explain something before we move forward. For this little side quest, I've given over control of Tentir to Kevin and shifted into the role of DM. We've played the game through a series of emails. I would set the scene and Kevin would write back with some actions. The narrative you've just heard is the dramatization of that exchange. While DMing, I wanted to introduce a good amount of chaos into the gameplay, so I decided to use dice to determine what each unexplored direction would lead to. On a D10, a 1 to 4 meant no danger or benefit. A 5 to 6 meant only danger, a 7 to 8 indicated only some kind of boon, and finally a 9 to 10 signified both a benefit and a danger. The second D10 would determine if there are any other exits in the new space. I wanted Tentir's excursion to be a high-risk, high-reward kind of situation, and told Kevin upfront, several times, that it would be dangerous. The first newly explored tunnel took Tentir to a collapsed stairwell. This was the result of a roll of 3, no danger, no benefit, and 5, no exit. Since I didn't want to waste narrative on a more or less empty room, I decided that Tentir would find a collapsed tunnel where the damage was oddly localized. This was a kind of clue, albeit a subtle one. When Kevin decided that Tentir would continue his exploration, I rolled another pair of D10s and got a 9 and a 3. Danger and benefit, and no exit. I came up with this idea of a room that holds suits of armor for father and son. As I was writing it, I realized that Learhain would never have worn the armor that was built for him. He didn't survive to an appropriate age to do so. That was a bit sad, but the story of Morak's family is a tragic one, so it feels appropriate. At this point, you know more than Kevin did when he was playing this section of the crypt. Actually, Kevin may well be listening to this right now, and if he is, I bet I've got his attention. There's no risk of spoilers, because by the time this episode is published, all decisions will have been set in stone months before. The current room does indeed hold a boon and a danger. The 2 flasks of oil are a little bonus. They are not the boon. The sword is. It's a parting gift from Learhain, who touched it with his spirit before finally returning to the Netherworld. We'll figure out what kind of enchantment he might have bestowed later on. For now, we need to talk about the danger. If you guessed that the chest is trapped, you guessed right. The chest isn't even a real chest, it's a fake. When opened, the lid pulls up a chain that runs through a cavity in the wall and up to the ceiling of the hall just outside the arch. The chain pulls out a pin that causes tons of masonry concealed in a cavity above the hall to come crashing down, sealing the armor room and anyone in it from the rest of the crypt. The trap is very similar to one sprung by tomb robbers long ago. Yep, that stairwell full of rubble was the result of a similar kind of thing. Just to twist the knife, inside the lid of the false chest is an inscription etched onto an iron plate. It's written in the language of the ancient K-Moors, but if translated would read the following: "Thief, our tomb is now yours as well." This whole idea came from my mythic event meaning, Stop Prison, by the way. Isn't mythic great? All this talk leads to the big question, will Kevin have Tentier open the chest? Is his curiosity as much or greater than his character's? Here's the email I sent him at this point in the story, working in all his choices thus far. Tentier glances at the closed chest, then suppresses his curiosity and carefully picks up the sword, secures the extra oil, and hefts the stanchion. He begins to make his way back to the others, proud of himself for having done the right thing. We can stop here if you're satisfied, or else let me know if there's anything else you wish to do. And how about you, listening to this right now? Would you have opened the chest? Do you think Kevin will change his mind and go back? I hope you can master your curiosity, because this is where the episode must end. We'll find out what Kevin and Tentier do next time. Thanks for listening to Tale of the Manticore. If you're enjoying the show and would like to help to support it, there are lots of ways to do so. You can recommend the show online, you can like and repost episode announcements on social media, you can pick up one of my offerings on DriveThruRPG or a t-shirt at www.beararts.store, and finally you can rate or review the show on your podcatcher of choice. I am super grateful for all of your support. At this point, I'd like to share a listener review. This one was left by D&D Dad on Apple Podcasts. D&D Dad writes, "This podcast is the catalyst of a new genre, solo play D&D and a fantasy novel. It's actually better in some ways because John gives a lot of careful thought to the interpretation of the dice after they determine random outcomes. As a GM, my players and I have to come up with this stuff on the fly, but his careful thought and creativity brings out amazing stories. Listening to this will make you a better DM/GM for sure. Please don't stop making it." Thank you so much, D&D Dad. I'm so glad that you're enjoying the show, and I'm very grateful for the review. Your words, and those of others who support me through reviews, not only help the show find a bigger audience, but they provide a great deal of encouragement to me personally. I really appreciate it, and I do not plan on stopping anytime soon. Also deserving of thanks are the members of my awesome cast. In this episode, we hear from Kevin Berenger, playing himself, and playing Tentier. And this episode also introduces Dana Kleek in the role of Tentier and Doreni's mother. Dana has asked me to share her email with other creators who are looking for a new voice. It's Dana M. Kleek, that's CLEEK, @gmail.com. Thanks very much, Kevin and Dana. A small but mighty cast this time around. For those curious to learn a bit more about Tale of the Manticore, I keep a blog where I post all kinds of show and RPG-related stuff, like art, maps, tables, crafts, and show notes. You can find it at taleofthemanticore.blogspot.com. To get in touch with me, I'm at Manticore Tale on X, taleofthemanticore.bluesky.social, Tale of the Manticore Podcast on Instagram, or taleofthemanticore@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. The adventure will continue on the next episode of Tale of the Manticore. It's the story where chaos rolls.